On a cold November night in 1981, the body of Hollywood star Natalie Wood was found floating in the chilling waters off Catalina Island. She had disappeared from her family's yacht after a fiery argument with her husband, actor Robert Wagner. The only other person on the boat was her co-star, Christopher Walken. Her death was initially ruled an accident, but the mysterious bruises on her body, the conflicting testimonies, and the decades-long silence told a completely different story, a story that police would later call extremely suspicious. The core question remains: did Natalie, the woman with an obsessive fear of water, really accidentally slip? Or are the bruises on her body the marks of a final confrontation? To search for the answer, we must look beyond that fateful night. We must explore the turbulent life that led her to that boat, a journey from a traumatized child star to a Hollywood icon, and confront the disturbing truth about the man beside her in her final moments, who remains the focus of the investigation to this day. To understand the creation of Natalie Wood, you first have to understand the forces that shaped her. She was a product of two distinct, powerful, and often clashing worlds. The first was the world of her parents, the displaced, dream-haunted world of the Russian émigré. In the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, thousands of Russians fled their homeland, carrying with them the ghosts of a lost world. Many, like Natalie's parents, settled in communities in San Francisco and Los Angeles, clinging to their culture while striving for a foothold in the bewildering, fast-paced landscape of America. They were driven by a potent mixture of pride in their heritage and a desperate hope for a better future, a future they often projected onto their children with crushing intensity. The second world was the one that would consume her, the Hollywood of the mid-20th century. This was the era of the all-powerful studio system, a time when monolithic corporations like MGM, Warner Brothers, and 20th Century Fox ruled as feudal kingdoms. They were factories, and their product was glamour. At the heart of this machine was a particularly volatile and profitable asset, the child star. Children were seen as adorable, malleable commodities. They were discovered, rebranded, and put to work in a relentless, often brutal environment that paid little attention to labor laws or emotional well-being. A child star's life was a dizzying schedule of tutoring, rehearsals, and performances, all under the watchful eye of two powerful forces: the studio heads who owned their contracts and the fiercely ambitious stage parents who saw their children as a ticket to fame and fortune. It was a world that could give a child incredible fame, but often at the cost of their own childhood. It was into this crucible, forged by immigrant dreams and the merciless mechanics of Hollywood, that a little girl named Natasha Zakharenko was thrust. She wasn't born Natalie Wood. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938 in San Francisco. Her father, Nikolai, was a quiet, unassuming man from Vladivostok. Though he had a background with some technical skills, he was forced to work as a carpenter and general laborer in America. He was a man haunted by the past, often finding solace in alcohol. Her mother, Maria Stepanovna, was the opposite. Maria was a force of nature, a small bird-like woman who possessed an iron will and a ferocious, all-consuming ambition. In Russia, she had reportedly dreamed of being a ballerina, a dream shattered by the revolution. In America, she transferred those thwarted ambitions onto her daughters. Before Natalia was even born, Maria had visited a fortune teller who allegedly predicted that her second daughter would become a world-famous star. For Maria, this was not a possibility. It was a prophecy, a sacred destiny that she would pursue with the fanaticism of a true believer. Natalia's life was mapped out for her before she took her first breath. The family moved to the outskirts of Hollywood, and Maria began her relentless campaign to get her daughter noticed. She enrolled Natalia in dance classes, paraded her in front of anyone who would look, and kept her ear to the ground for any whisper of a film production. The opportunity came in 1943 when a film crew came to their town of Santa Rosa. Maria, in a display of her legendary pushiness, managed to get her small, dark-eyed daughter a brief 15-second part as a little girl who drops an ice cream cone. It was enough. The film's director, Irving Pichel, was taken with the child's astonishing ability to follow direction and her expressive, soulful eyes that seemed to hold a sadness far beyond her years. He told Maria to bring her to Hollywood if they were ever serious about a film career. For Maria, it was a command from the heavens. The family packed up and moved to Los Angeles. The Zakharenko name was shed, deemed too ethnic, too Russian for American audiences. Natalia became Natalie Wood, a name chosen by the studio, and her life as a contract player began. Maria was her constant companion, her coach, her protector, and her tormentor. Her first major role came in the 1946 film Tomorrow is Forever, opposite the legendary Orson Welles. It was on the set of this film that two of the most disturbing and defining events of her young life occurred. The first involved a scene on a rickety wooden bridge that was designed to collapse. During one of the takes, something went wrong, and the 5-year-old Natalie was plunged into the icy water below. She was terrified. The fall resulted in a badly broken wrist, which Maria, fearful of disrupting the production, failed to have properly treated. The bone healed incorrectly, leaving Natalie with a slight malformation at the wrist that she would hide with bracelets for the rest of her life. More damaging than the physical scar, however, was the psychological one. The incident solidified a deep-seated, profound terror of dark, murky water. But the second event was even more sinister. For a crucial scene, Natalie was required to weep with genuine terror. When she couldn't produce the tears on cue, the director grew frustrated. Maria, ever the pragmatist, took her daughter aside just out of camera shot. According to Natalie's later accounts to her sister and closest friends, Maria caught a butterfly, a creature Natalie adored. As Natalie watched, her mother held the butterfly up and then, deliberately, coldly, tore its wings off. The child's subsequent shrieks of horror were utterly real. The director got his shot, and Natalie Wood learned the most brutal lesson of her young life. Her genuine emotions were a commodity, her trauma was a tool for the camera, and her mother's love was conditional on her ability to perform. Despite the hidden traumas, her career flourished. In 1947, she became a household name, charming audiences around the world as the precocious Susan Walker in the Christmas classic, Miracle on 34th Street. She was perfect in the role, her old soul seriousness making her utterly believable as a child who had stopped believing in fairy tales. She was now America's sweetheart, a doe-eyed symbol of childhood innocence. She worked constantly, appearing in over 20 films as a child, sacrificing a normal life of school and friends for the grueling schedule of a professional actress. She was the family's primary breadwinner, the vessel for her mother's relentless ambition, a little girl carrying the weight of her entire family on her small shoulders. But as she entered her teenage years, she faced the challenge that destroys most child actors, the awkward transition to adult roles. The studios were unsure what to do with her. She was no longer a cute child, but not yet a leading lady. For a few years, her career stalled. But Natalie, unlike so many before her, possessed her mother's iron will. She was determined not to fade away. She was ready to fight for serious, complex roles. and that determination would lead her to an event that would leave another, far deeper scar, and then to the film that would change her life forever. It was during this vulnerable period at the age of 16 that one of the darkest and most closely guarded secrets of her life allegedly took place. As her sister Lana and biographer Suzanne Finstad have painstakingly detailed, Natalie claimed she was summoned to a meeting at a hotel with an immensely powerful A-list movie star, an audition orchestrated by her own mother. Natalie told her sister and friends that the meeting was a pretext and that she was brutally assaulted by the actor. She said she returned to the car, traumatized and bleeding, only to have her mother ask, "Did you learn your lesson?" This alleged trauma and her mother's horrifying complicity shattered what was left of her innocence. It would frame her relationships with men for the rest of her life, instilling in her a deep-seated anxiety and a desperate, paradoxical need for both safety and male approval. It was this very pain, this reservoir of authentic teenage anguish, that she would channel into her breakout adult role. In 1955, she fought tooth and nail for the part of Judy in Rebel Without a Cause. The director, Nicholas Ray, didn't think the sweet girl from Miracle on 34th Street had the necessary grit, but Natalie was living the part. After a real-life car accident, a doctor was overheard calling her a goddamn juvenile delinquent. Natalie reportedly turned to Ray and said, "Now, do I get the part?" She did. Rebel Without a Cause was a cultural phenomenon. It perfectly captured the angst and confusion of a generation and turned Natalie Wood and her enigmatic co-star James Dean into overnight icons of teenage rebellion. Natalie delivered a raw, vulnerable, and sexually awakened performance that earned her her first Academy Award nomination. She had successfully made the leap. She was no longer a child actor. She was a serious, powerful movie star. On set, she developed a close bond with James Dean and a more complicated, possibly romantic one, with the director Nicholas Ray. But it was the film's legacy that would become most haunting. Of its 3 young stars, all would meet tragic, untimely deaths. James Dean was killed in a car crash before the film was even released. Sal Mineo was murdered in a robbery in 1976. And Natalie's own fate, on a dark night 26 years later, would become the most mysterious of all. Having survived the brutal machinery of the studio system, she had finally found her voice. But the traumas of her past had laid a dangerous and unstable foundation for the woman she was yet to become. Having survived the crucible of child stardom and the deep traumas of her youth, Natalie Wood emerged with Rebel Without a Cause, not just as a movie star, but as an icon. She had conquered the professional world, proving her talent and resilience. Now she turned that same fierce determination toward her personal life, seeking the one thing the studio lights could not provide, a perfect storybook love. This quest would lead her into the arms of Hollywood's handsome prince, Robert Wagner, and into the most acclaimed and emotionally demanding period of her career, where the price of becoming a legend would be tested against the fragility of her own heart. With the explosive success of Rebel Without a Cause, Natalie Wood had achieved the impossible. She had not only survived the treacherous transition from child actor to adult star, she had redefined it, emerging as a fiery, talented, and Oscar-nominated actress who spoke for an entire generation. The shy, controlled girl named Natasha was now buried beneath a confident new persona. She was a star, and Hollywood, which had nearly discarded her, was now at her feet. Having found her artistic voice, she now set out to write the next chapter of her life, a chapter she hoped would be a perfect Hollywood romance, a fairy tale to erase the dark prologue of her youth. The prince in her fairy tale was Robert Wagner, known to his friends as R.J. Wagner was 8 years her senior, and the epitome of the suave, handsome studio star. He was charming, ambitious, and moved through the Hollywood social scene with an easy confidence. Natalie had harbored a crush on him since she was a young girl, once famously pointing to his picture and telling her mother, "I'm going to marry him someday." In 1956, on her 18th birthday, the studio arranged a formal date. The chemistry was undeniable, and the publicity machine went into overdrive. Their courtship was a public spectacle, a dream romance played out on the pages of Photoplay and Life magazine. They were young, beautiful, and madly in love. They were Hollywood's new golden couple, a perfect embodiment of the glamour and optimism of the era. For Natalie, who had grown up in a chaotic and emotionally starved household, Wagner represented stability, sophistication, and a kind of all-American wholesomeness she craved. He was her anchor, her protector. On December the 28th, 1957, in a lavish ceremony attended by Hollywood royalty, Natalie Wood, at the age of 19, became Mrs. Robert Wagner. To the world, it was the perfect ending to the first act of her adult life. But behind the carefully curated images of wedded bliss, the reality was far more complex. Their marriage was a collision of two people who had been shaped and in many ways damaged by the very system that was now celebrating them. Natalie, for all her newfound fame, was still deeply insecure, plagued by the traumas of her past and her lifelong need for validation. Wagner, while a rising star, was reportedly intensely jealous, not just of other men, but of his wife's more significant fame and her burgeoning reputation as a serious, acclaimed actress. Their arguments, fueled by insecurity and alcohol, became the stuff of Hollywood legend. They were two performers playing the roles of the perfect husband and wife, but struggling to connect as real people when the cameras were off. Professionally, however, Natalie was entering the most significant period of her career. She was determined to prove that her success in Rebel was no fluke. In 1956, she took on a challenging role in John Ford's epic western, The Searchers. Working with the notoriously tyrannical Ford in the legendary John Wayne was a baptism by fire. The production was arduous, but Natalie proved her mettle, delivering a nuanced performance that demonstrated her range. She was no longer just a teen idol. She was a versatile actress, capable of holding the screen with the giants of the industry. But she craved roles that would allow her to explore the complex, turbulent emotions that she so often suppressed in her own life. That opportunity came in 1961 with a script that would push her to the absolute brink, professionally and personally. The film was Splendour in the Grass. Directed by the great Elia Kazan, Splendour in the Grass was a searing drama about a passionate, small-town girl named Deanie Loomis, whose sexual repression and heartbreak drive her to a complete emotional breakdown. It was a raw, challenging, and deeply psychological role, and Natalie knew she had to have it. Kazan was initially skeptical, but in her audition he saw what lay beneath the polished movie star exterior, a profound and terrifying vulnerability. He saw a young woman who was, in his words, a strange combination of the calculated and the truly spontaneous, a person whose own life was a battle between a controlled surface and a chaotic inner world. He gave her the part. The role of Deanie was more than just a performance for Natalie. It was an exorcism. To play a character spiraling into madness, she was forced to tap into her own deepest fears and traumas. Her complicated relationship with her mother, her desperate need for love, the emotional fallout from the assault she had endured, and the suffocating pressure to be the good girl. The film's most famous scene, in which Deanie has a breakdown in a bathtub, was so emotionally draining that Natalie was left physically and mentally exhausted for days. Complicating matters further was her co-star, a charismatic and ambitious newcomer named Warren Beatty. Their on-screen chemistry was electric, and it quickly spilled over into a passionate off-screen affair. For Natalie, Beatty represented an intellectual and artistic intensity that was a world away from her life with Wagner. The affair was a symptom of a marriage that was already crumbling under the weight of jealousy and misunderstanding. She was torn between the safe, familiar love of her husband and the dangerous, exciting allure of her co-star. Splendour in the Grass was a triumph. Natalie's performance was hailed as a masterpiece of raw emotional power, earning her her second Academy Award nomination, this time for Best Actress. She had proven herself to be one of the finest actresses of her generation. But the personal cost was immense. The film had cracked her open, leaving her emotionally fragile and forcing her to confront demons she had long kept buried. The fairy tale marriage to Robert Wagner was over. They separated shortly after filming, and their divorce was finalized in 1962. As her personal life was imploding, her career reached its commercial zenith. In 1961, the same year as Splendour in the Grass, she starred as Maria in the film adaptation of the Broadway smash hit West Side Story. The film was a global phenomenon, a cultural landmark that redefined the movie musical. Natalie poured her heart into the role of the innocent, love-struck Maria, and her radiant performance was central to the film's 10 Academy Awards and its legendary status. But even this monumental success was tainted by a painful, behind-the-scenes betrayal. Natalie had worked for months on her singing, hoping to prove she could carry the musical numbers herself. The producers, however, had always intended to use a professional ghost singer. Unaware of this, Natalie recorded all of her songs, believing her voice would be in the final film. It was only deep into the production that she was told the devastating truth. Her vocals had been entirely replaced by those of the veteran ghost singer, Marni Nixon. Natalie was utterly humiliated. The deception was a cruel echo of the control and manipulation she had experienced her entire life. It reinforced her deepest insecurity that she was not and would never be quite good enough. She felt like a fraud in her own greatest success. She had now earned 2 Oscar nominations in a single year and starred in the biggest film in the world. Yet she felt more insecure and disillusioned with Hollywood than ever before. The period between 1961 and 1962 was the apex of her career and the nadir of her personal life. The end of her marriage to Wagner had left her heartbroken and adrift. The intense emotional excavation required for Splendour in the Grass had left her psychologically drained. The betrayal on the set of West Side Story had left her feeling used by the industry she had given her life to. She was at the top of her profession, and she was falling apart. She did something that was almost unheard of for a star of her magnitude. She took a step back. She bought her own home, went into intensive psychoanalysis, a practice she would continue for the rest of her life, and tried to figure out who Natalie Wood was, away from the sets, the scripts, and the men who had defined her. She had achieved the dream her mother had set out for her, the dream she had worked for since she was 4 years old. But now, standing at the summit, she found herself profoundly alone, forced to confront the question of whether the spectacular, painful climb had been worth it at all. By 1962, Natalie Wood had reached the summit. With 3 Oscar nominations and a string of iconic films, she was the undisputed queen of her generation. But the view from the top was devastating. The personal cost of her magnificent performances, combined with a shattered marriage, had left her psychologically broken and utterly disillusioned. When the dream you've chased your entire life finally comes true only to leave you empty, what do you do next? For Natalie, the answer was to walk away. The next chapter would be a deliberate intermission from the spotlight, a search for a quieter identity through a new marriage, the profound joy of motherhood, and an attempt to rebuild her life before the powerful ghost of her past love returned to rewrite her future. The early 1960s had catapulted Natalie Wood to the stratosphere of fame, but the journey had left her in a state of personal freefall. The divorce from Robert Wagner, the man she believed was her soulmate, had shattered her fairy tale image of love. The emotional toll of her Oscar-nominated performance in Splendour in the Grass had left her psychologically raw, and the industry's betrayal on the set of West Side Story had deepened her disillusionment with the very business that had raised her. She was one of the most famous women in the world, and she was profoundly lost. Rather than diving into another film, she did something radical for a star of her stature. She put her career on hold. She entered intensive psychoanalysis, a journey of self-discovery she would remain committed to for the rest of her life. For the first time, she began to deliberately untangle the complex, suffocating knot of her relationship with her mother, Maria, and confront the deep-seated traumas of her childhood. She was determined to find an identity that wasn't defined by a director's vision, a studio's contract, or a man's love. She was searching for Natasha, the girl who had been lost beneath the polished veneer of Natalie Wood. Her life was still far from private. Her tumultuous on-again, off-again relationship with Warren Beatty made them the most talked-about couple in Hollywood. He was brilliant, charismatic, and notoriously difficult, a fellow survivor of the Hollywood machine who understood its pressures. Theirs was a passionate, intellectual, and fiery partnership. Beatty encouraged her to be more assertive in her career, to demand more respect and control from the studios, but the relationship was also volatile, plagued by their mutual insecurities and Beatty's well-known philandering. While the affair was a significant chapter in her personal education, it was not the stable, secure love she ultimately craved. Professionally, she returned to the screen, but with a new sense of purpose. She began choosing roles that were lighter, more comedic, a conscious step away from the emotionally draining dramas that had defined her peak. She dazzled in films like The Great Race and Sex and The Single Girl, proving her skill as a sophisticated comedian. She earned her third Oscar nomination for 1963's Love with the Proper Stranger, a tender and realistic romance co-starring Steve McQueen. She was taking control, proving her versatility and business acumen, but the drive that had once consumed her was beginning to wane. Her focus was shifting from the call sheet to a different kind of script, one that involved a husband, a home, and a family, far from the Klieg lights. In 1966, while living in London, she found the man she believed could offer her that new life. Richard Gregson was a British producer and writer, a man of quiet intelligence and sophisticated charm. He was an industry insider, but he was not a movie star. He was grounded, mature, and seemingly unthreatened by her fame. For Natalie, he represented a different kind of future, one based not on the high drama of Hollywood, but on a shared desire for a normal life. Their courtship was private and deep. He was patient, kind, and offered her a sense of safety she had never known. In May 1969, they were married in a simple, heartfelt ceremony at her mother's home. It was the opposite of her first lavish wedding to Wagner. This time, it felt real, a union of two adults, not two movie stars. A year later, in 1970, their happiness was compounded by the birth of their daughter, Natasha Gregson. Motherhood transformed Natalie. The love she felt for her daughter was a revelation, a pure, unconditional love that was completely separate from her career or her public image. She embraced her new role with a passion that eclipsed any she had felt for a film part. For a time, she was blissfully happy. She had a loving husband, a beautiful child, and a quiet life away from the relentless scrutiny of Hollywood. She had finally achieved the intermission she had so desperately craved. But the ghosts of her past were not so easily banished. The deep-seated patterns of her life, her insecurities, her need for intense romantic connection began to resurface. The quiet stability of her life with Gregson, once a comfort, began to feel like a cage of a different sort. According to her closest friends, she began to feel a familiar restlessness, a sense that something vital was missing. The marriage began to fracture under the strain. In 1971, after she reportedly discovered Gregson was having an affair, the dream of a quiet, normal life came to an end. They separated, and Natalie was once again heartbroken, facing the failure of a second marriage. Adrift and in pain, she found herself leaning on the one person who had understood the unique pressures of her life better than anyone. A man from her past who was also older, wiser, and chastened by his own romantic failures. She reached out to her first husband, Robert Wagner. Their reunion stunned Hollywood. It was the stuff of movie scripts, a second act that no one saw coming. Wagner, who had also remarried and divorced, had never stopped loving her. "I would have crawled on my hands and knees to get her back," he later wrote. Their courtship this time was different. It was quieter, deeper, forged not in the white-hot glare of young stardom, but in a shared history of love, loss, and regret. They had both lived other lives, but they found that the path for each of them ultimately led back to the other. In July 1972, they remarried, this time not in a grand church, but quietly, on a boat off the coast of Catalina Island. It was a deeply symbolic choice, a reclamation of their love story on their own terms. 2 years later, in 1974, they welcomed their daughter, Courtney Wagner. Natalie was now a devoted mother of two, blending their family, Natasha Courtney and Wagner's daughter, from his previous marriage, Katie, into a loving, if unconventional, unit. To the outside world, the fairy tale had finally come true. The golden couple had found their way back to each other, their love story even more compelling for its intermission. They settled into a life that was a mix of Hollywood glamour and comfortable domesticity. But as the 1970s wore on, the old demons began to stir. The familiar cocktail of professional pressures, alcohol, and deep-seated jealousies had not disappeared. It had simply been lying dormant. By the late 1970s, Natalie was navigating the difficult terrain of being an actress over 40. The juicy leading roles were becoming scarcer, and she felt the pressure to prove she was still a relevant, bankable star. At the same time, Wagner's career was experiencing a major resurgence with the hit television series Heart to Heart. The dynamic of their first marriage, where her star had eclipsed his, was now reversed. According to friends and biographers, this shift created a new and potent source of tension in their relationship. The old insecurities on both sides began to bubble to the surface. In 1981, she accepted a leading role in the science fiction film Brainstorm, hoping it would mark a significant big-screen comeback. Her co-star was the intense, enigmatic, and critically acclaimed actor, Christopher Walken. On set, Natalie and Walken developed a close professional friendship, but Wagner, by his own admission, was consumed by a powerful jealousy, reportedly convinced that their friendship was an affair. The tension between the three of them simmered throughout the production. That tension would come to a head over the Thanksgiving holiday weekend. To relax, Natalie and RJ invited Walken to join them for a trip to their beloved escape, Catalina Island, aboard their yacht, the Splendour. It was a gesture meant to clear the air, to bring the three of them together. But instead of resolving the conflict, that fateful weekend on the water would ignite it, leading to a night of rage, fear, and a final terrifying silence. The intermission was over, and the final tragic act was about to begin. The fairy tale, it seemed, was back. The stunning reconciliation of Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner was more than a private reunion. It was a Hollywood ending come to life. With their blended family and renewed love, they had seemingly found a mature, lasting happiness. But beneath the surface of this perfect second act, the old demons of jealousy, insecurity, and professional rivalry were beginning to stir. Their fateful invitation to co-star Christopher Walken for a Thanksgiving getaway to Catalina Island was meant to be a simple holiday. Instead, it would become the final stage where all their simmering tensions would finally boil over, turning a pleasure cruise into a claustrophobic theater of rage and suspicion, and setting the scene for the final terrifying hours of Natalie Wood's life. For Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner, Catalina Island was supposed to be a sanctuary, a cherished escape from the pressures of Hollywood, just 26 miles across the sea. Their yacht, the Splendour, was their floating haven, a place of happy memories. But as they set sail on Friday, November 27, 1981, the boat was not carrying them toward a relaxing holiday. It was a pressure cooker carrying 3 movie stars, a simmering jealousy, and a fourth man who would become the reluctant witness to a tragedy. That man was Dennis Davern, the yacht's 25-year-old captain. Davern was more than just an employee. He was a friend, a confidant, a man who had worked for the Wagners for years. He was fiercely loyal, particularly to Natalie, but he was also caught in the middle of their increasingly volatile relationship. He knew better than anyone that the golden couple's second act was not the idyllic romance the public believed it to be. And from the moment their guest, Christopher Walken, stepped on board, Davern felt a palpable sense of dread. The air, he would later recall, was thick with an unspoken tension. The first night, Friday, was deceptively calm. But the next day, Saturday, November 28th, the fissures began to show. The day was spent on shore, moving between the island's bars and restaurants. The drinking started early and continued steadily. Eyewitnesses who saw the famous trio that day would later report a strange dynamic. Natalie seemed withdrawn, anxious. Wagner appeared moody, his famous charm replaced by a grim intensity. One observer noted that he seemed to be pointedly ignoring his wife. The simmering conflict finally boiled over that evening at dinner. The group went to Doug's Harbor Reef, a popular waterfront restaurant. According to Dennis Davern's detailed accounts, the meal was an agonizingly tense affair. He claimed Wagner was seething with jealousy, infuriated by the easy rapport and professional admiration between Natalie and Walken. The conversation kept turning to Natalie's career, to her dedication as an artist. At one point, Walken allegedly told Wagner that Natalie deserved to be a work of art and that she needed to sacrifice her personal life at times for her career, as all great artists do. To Wagner, this was a direct challenge. It implied he was holding his wife back. The final straw, Davern claimed, came when the restaurant owner sent a bottle of champagne to their table. Wagner, feeling slighted that it was meant for Walken, flew into a quiet rage. The dinner ended abruptly. As they rowed the dinghy back to the Splendour under the cold, dark sky, the mood was openly hostile. The stage was set for the final, explosive confrontation. Back on board, in the main salon of the yacht, The carefully maintained facade of civility shattered completely. The argument that had been brewing all day erupted. According to Davern, Natalie and Walken were talking, and Wagner, who had been stewing, suddenly picked up a bottle of wine and smashed it on the table before them. Shards of glass flew across the salon. "What are you trying to do?" Wagner allegedly screamed at Walken, his voice filled with fury. "Sleep with my wife?" Walken, stunned into silence, calmly stood up and retreated to his guest cabin, closing the door on the marital firestorm. But his departure only intensified the conflict. The fight now turned solely on Natalie. Davern described a vicious, ugly argument between husband and wife, with Wagner accusing her of infidelity and disrespect. Natalie, no longer a passive victim, fought back. The screaming match moved from the salon to the master stateroom at the back of the boat. Davern, unnerved, turned up the volume on the stereo, a desperate attempt to drown out the sounds of the escalating rage. A few minutes later, he heard the fight move from the stateroom out onto the aft deck, the small open area at the very back of the yacht. He heard shouting, the sound of things being thrown or bumped, and then suddenly a terrifying absolute silence. A few minutes after the silence fell, Dennis Davern saw Robert Wagner reappear in the main salon. He looked, in Davern's words, disheveled, flushed, and sweating. He was alone. In a calm, almost casual voice, Wagner said, "Natalie is missing." Davern was panicked, but he claimed Wagner seemed strangely unconcerned. When Davern went to turn on the yacht's powerful floodlights to search the dark water, Wagner allegedly stopped him. "Don't do that," he said. "We don't want to alert all these people." He suggested they shouldn't do anything that might create a scandal that might tarnish their public image. He theorized that Natalie had probably taken off in the dinghy in a fit of pique and would return. For more than an hour they waited. But she didn't return. It was only then, well after 1 a.m., that Robert Wagner finally authorized the call for help. The initial radio call to the shore patrol was strangely nonchalant, reporting a missing boat, not a missing person. The full-scale search for Natalie Wood did not begin until much later that morning. The delay in calling for help remains one of the most inexplicable and suspicious elements of the entire case. The search ended at 7:44 a.m. on Sunday morning. Natalie Wood's body was found by the authorities, floating face down in the water, about a mile away from the yacht and 200 yards off the shore of a small cove. She was wearing a red down jacket over a flannel nightgown and wool socks. The yacht's dinghy, the Valiant, was found beached nearby. The world awoke to the shocking news, and the official story began to form. That story was solidified by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, the famed coroner to the stars. After conducting the autopsy, Noguchi found that Natalie had a blood alcohol content of 0.14%, well above the legal driving limit. He also documented the now infamous bruises on her arms and body and the abrasion on her cheek. But he came to a controversial conclusion. He declared her death an accidental drowning, theorizing that Natalie had gone to retie the dinghy, had slipped on the swim step, hit her head, and fallen into the water, unconscious. The bruises, he argued, were consistent with such a fall. According to Dennis Davern, this accident narrative was carefully coordinated. He claims that in the hours after the body was found, he was flown back to the mainland and taken to Wagner's home. There, he says, he, Wagner, and a silent Christopher Walken were coached by lawyers to stick to the same simple story, a story that made no mention of the violent argument, the smashed wine bottle, or the long, inexplicable delay in calling for help. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department accepted the coroner's conclusion. The case was officially closed in less than 2 weeks. The world was told it was a heartbreaking accident, a tragic end to a beautiful life. But for those who knew about the fight, the bruises, the captain's fear, and Natalie's lifelong terror of the water, the story was full of holes. The official file was closed, but for many the real investigation had just begun. A secret was now buried, festering in the dark, waiting for the passage of time to slowly, inevitably bring it to the light. With the case officially stamped accidental and closed in 1981, a wall of silence descended around the death of Natalie Wood. The official story, however, was as unsteady as a boat in a storm, full of holes that time could not patch. While Hollywood carried on, the haunting inconsistencies of that night, the bruises, the argument, the delayed call for help, refused to be buried. For 30 years, the truth lay dormant, kept alive only by the whispers of insiders and the relentless quest of a grieving sister. This was not an ending, but a long, cold pause before the story's final explosive chapter, when new testimony would emerge, forcing law enforcement to reopen the case and turning a tragic piece of Hollywood folklore into a live, modern-day mystery. The official file on the death of Natalie Wood was closed, but the case was never truly over. For 30 years, it festered, becoming one of Hollywood's most notorious open secrets. In public, a narrative of tragic misfortune was maintained. Robert Wagner continued his successful career, most notably with the television series Heart to Heart, and spoke lovingly of his late wife in memoirs, always sticking to the story of a terrible accident. Christopher Walken, famously private, rarely spoke of the incident at all, and when he did, his comments were brief and vague. The Hollywood code of silence held firm. But behind the scenes, the doubts lingered, kept alive by two key figures who refused to let the questions die. The first was Natalie's younger sister, Lana Wood. Driven by a fierce love for her sister and a deep suspicion of the official story, Lana embarked on a decades-long, often lonely crusade for answers, writing books and giving interviews, keeping the case in the public consciousness. The second and most crucial figure was Dennis Davern. The boat's captain lived in obscurity for years, haunted and, by his own account, intimidated into silence. But in 2009, alongside author Marty Rulli, he finally published a book, Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendour. A detailed, explosive, minute-by-minute account of what he claimed really happened that night. He laid out the story of a jealous rage, a violent argument, a suspicious silence, and a deliberate delay in calling for help. He alleged a cover-up, orchestrated by Wagner and his lawyers in the hours after Natalie's body was found. The book provided what investigators had been missing for 3 decades, a credible inside witness who was now willing to go on the record and formally recant his original story. Davern's public confession was the catalyst. In November 2011, on the eve of the 30th anniversary of her death, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department made a stunning announcement. They were officially reopening the investigation into the death of Natalie Wood, citing new and substantial information. The cold case was suddenly hot, and the story was front-page news around the world. The first official bombshell came in 2012. After a thorough review of the original autopsy and other evidence, the LA County Chief Medical Examiner officially amended Natalie's death certificate. The cause of death was changed from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. In the official report, the coroner stated that many of the bruises on Natalie's body were more consistent with injuries from an assault than from a simple fall into the water. It was a stunning reversal, a formal public admission by the authorities that the original story was no longer believable. The possibility of foul play was now officially on the table. The investigation continued quietly for years until another bombshell dropped in February 2018. In an interview with the television program 48 Hours, the lead homicide detective on the reopened case, Lieutenant John Carina, publicly named Robert Wagner a person of interest. Carina stated that after years of investigation, Wagner's version of events just doesn't add up. He revealed that Wagner's story had changed over time and that he had refused to be interviewed by detectives since the case was reopened. The detective concluded he is a person of interest because he was the last one with Natalie Wood, and somehow she ends up in the water and drowns. The accusation that had been whispered for decades was now being voiced by law enforcement itself. The case remains open to this day, unsolved but not forgotten. In the decades since her death, the story of Natalie Wood has transcended from a tragic headline to one of Hollywood's most defining and haunting mysteries. The unanswered questions have cast a long, dark shadow over everyone involved. The case has become a cultural touchstone, a grim reminder of the secrets that can lie beneath the most glamorous of surfaces, a dark piece of American folklore that refuses to fade. For her family, the aftermath has been a story of division and pain. Her sister, Lana Wood, has dedicated her life to seeking what she calls justice for Natalie, a relentless and public campaign that has often put her at odds with Natalie's daughters, who have largely maintained a protective silence, choosing to remember their mother for the life she lived, not the way she died. Robert Wagner's career continued, but the unresolved questions about that night have followed him for 40 years, forever attaching an asterisk of suspicion to his name and legacy. Culturally, Natalie Wood's legacy is twofold. First and foremost, she is remembered as a gifted and luminous actress. From Miracle on 34th Street to West Side Story and Splendour in the Grass, her performances captured a unique blend of innocence and turmoil, leaving behind an indelible mark on cinema history. She was a bridge between the old studio system and the new Hollywood, an artist whose vulnerability on screen felt breathtakingly real. But her death gave her a second, darker legacy. She became a symbol of the Hollywood machine's ultimate price, her story a cautionary tale about the toxic mix of fame, passion, and jealousy. The mystery surrounding her final hours ensures that every new generation discovers her story, keeping the debate and her memory alive. Her case, re-examined in the modern post-Me Too era, has also forced a renewed scrutiny on the power dynamics of old Hollywood and the code of silence that for so long protected its most powerful figures. We will likely never know for certain what happened in the final terrifying moments of Natalie Wood's life. The silence of those who were there has proven to be as impenetrable as the dark ocean water itself. But the true tragedy of her story is not just in its unresolved ending, but in the central, heartbreaking irony of her life. A woman who was deathly afraid of the water died alone in it, surrounded by people who claimed to love her. She was the girl who survived the brutal machinery of child stardom, who navigated the treacherous waters of Hollywood to become a true icon, only to be consumed by a secret in the end. Her story is a heartbreaking reminder that behind every dazzling image, behind every Hollywood legend, there is a human being with fears, vulnerabilities, and a story that is often far more complex than the one we see on screen. Natalie Wood was more than a star and more than a mystery. She was the girl named Natasha, who dreamed of a normal life and who deserved an ending that wasn't shrouded in doubt and darkness.